All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And to those of us joining from Asia, I guess also wish you a very good evening. My name is Philippe RHEAULT. I'm the director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta, and I'll be your moderator today. China Institute at the University of Alberta is Canada's largest think tank dedicated to the study of China. We try to deepen understanding of China, uh, chart some potential paths for Canada-China relations, but also we seek to consider how we can encourage enlightened engagement with China in areas of global importance as well. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here today, to be talking with Dr. Nong Hong and our distinguished panel about a new book that's out, a third book on maritime issues that has been published by Dr. Nong. And so today we're going to run through a little bit of that monograph, and we're also going to seek to unpack a little bit the some of the dynamics and dimensions of U.S. and China maritime relations and the way they're projecting their presence and influence, not only in the South China Sea, but so we're going to be doing this with the help of a distinguished panel that I will introduce a little bit later on. But first, I think we're going to turn in the moment to Nong and see whether Nong can enlighten us a little bit about give us some of the key highlights of what her book is trying to touch upon. I think this is a particularly relevant time to be doing that. China is slowly moving from being a regional maritime power to one that has an increasing global reach, especially when it considers areas such as the Arctic, the Antarctic, and also the Indian Ocean. Issues don't only touch on security matters, but when you look at China's projection and the interaction with the United States, it also touches upon issues related to trade, to access to resources, and of course as well, looking at ways where China, the United States, and also other actors in the world can actually collaborate in order to kind of like secure the global commons and find ways of ensuring a more sustainable approach to maritime exploration and our presence in the seas around the world. It's also particularly timely because you can see how some other countries are slowly starting to try to assert their own influence. So when you look at U.S.-China maritime relations, you also have to take into account perhaps a slightly increased assertiveness of countries like Japan. Russia has a new dynamic as well. And of course, in ASEAN, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam as well are increasingly kind of vocal in terms of trying to project what they see as their interests into the equation. So very multidimensional. And of course, given that we're now slipping into summertime soon, I have to start thinking about the calculus with respect to a U.S. political agenda and whether the kind of fairly understandable and predictable kind of Biden administration approach to maritime issues, whether there would be a continuum under a Trump administration, right? I hope as well that not only in my chat with Nong, but also when we listen to the panelists, that we have a chance as well to be fairly positive and forward-looking in terms of trying to identify areas where there's not just potential rivalry, but also creative ideas in terms of how we can do a better job of collaborating in the maritime sphere. So with that, perhaps we can start a conversation. Nong. Maybe I can introduce you very briefly. It's my honor to do so. Nong has a PhD of interdisciplinary study of international law and international relations from the University of Alberta, which is where our institute is based. And in fact, Nong held a postdoctoral fellowship at our university's China Institute in the past. She was also an ITLOS Nippon Fellow for International Dispute Settlement and visiting fellow at Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, the Center of Oceans Law and Policy, University of Virginia, and also the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law. She is concurrently a research fellow with the China Institute at the University of Alberta and the National Institute for the South China Sea Studies. She's also a senior fellow, Beijing Club for International Dialogue. So as you can see, quite an extensive experience there. And clearly, in recent years, Nong's research has been taking an interdisciplinary approach to examining international relations and international law, with a particular focus on international relations and comparative politics in general, ocean governance in East Asia and the Arctic, the law of the sea, international security, particularly non-traditional security, and international dispute settlement and conflict resolution. Their selected publications include U.S.-China Global Maritime Relations, 2024. We're going to talk about that. China's role in the Arctic, Observing and Being Observed, 2020. And UNCLOS, and Ocean Dispute Settlement, Law and Politics in the South China Sea, 2012. So I've had a chance to read some of those books. I found them very enlightening and informative. So Nong, first of all, congratulations on your third book.
Yeah. Thank you for flying all the way from Canada to moderate today's discussion.
It's my pleasure. Yeah. So you've been writing about these issues for a long time. Maybe you can share with us what prompted you to write a third monograph on this issue with the particular focus you have now.
Yeah, thank you, Philippe. I think as Philippe mentioned, this is the third book of my series of maritime-related publication. And recall that my first book was published back in 2012. So I look at, for instance, the Law of the Sea Convention, the 1982 UNCLOS, its role in addressing the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. So that book actually is very legal, although it's an interdisciplinary study, but I focus more, it's like 80% of the book is purely understanding the dispute settlement mechanism of UNCLOS and how it's applicable to a different maritime dispute in the South China Sea, like legal islands regime and archipelago, all of relevant on the South China Sea. So in the process of writing that book, I understand that even though it's focused on the South China Sea, I'm not looking particularly whether it's China. I touch all these countries relevant coastal states, Vietnam and Philippines, Indonesia, and the historical base and the legal argument. And then I noticed that I write substantially on the U.S. role, because back in 2012, I think U.S.-China have a lot of engagement in the South China Sea. So back then, I think my writing focused a lot on, for instance, legal debate between the U.S. and China about the scope of free navigation, which is a term the U.S. frequently use when addressing its activity in the South China Sea. And also, I used the EP3 incident in 2021 to elaborate why China and the U.S. differ from each other when it comes to the term free navigation or military activities in the foreign countries. So that was how I relate China and the U.S. in that context. And the second book you mentioned is on Arctic. And I have to thank the China Institute for supporting my postdoc research, which I focus a lot on China's Arctic policy. And then I realized China has this Arctic policy white paper published in 2018. And then I spent a lot of time looking at China's policy in the region. And then I realized, in addition to address China's engagement with different sectors like shipping, like research, like also global governance through the Arctic Council. And then I realized it's also very important to look at how China engage or how it's perceived by Arctic leaders, including the United States. So I do have a chapter in that book writing substantially on the U.S. and China relationship in the Arctic. And then after a few years, the third book I want to mention, because my job in the China Institute for China American Studies was dated back in 2015. And then throughout all this year, I realized that a lot of the U.S.-China engagement is cover a lot of issues, including maritime study, which is my research focus on. And then I realized that it's very necessary for me to look broader than the South China Sea and the Arctic, and to put the two countries' policy development and strategy goal in the whole broader picture. That is why I brought into different chapters. There are 6 chapters discussing different maritime zones. I'm not trying to be very ambitious, and not a lot of going on this. I started from the South China Sea and the Northeast Asia water, including the Yellow Sea and including East China Sea, and then the South Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, Arctic, and Antarctic. I don't want to be ambitious, but the more I look into the two countries, either policy development or their different interpretation of the sea, and I realized that I have to bring all those maritime regions into the fore in order to understand why these two countries, whether they are diverge from each other on some very key issues, or trying to find whether they have some common interests to reflect the two countries' maritime relations. Well, that's how I want to write this book. Not trying to be ambitious, but I think it's very necessary.
Yeah, but it's challenging, right? And I think you've actually managed to find that right balance between breadth and depth, right? I mean, these are topics where a lot of people are curious and to focus on one area or another. For example, Greg might actually spend more of his time thinking about the Indo-Pacific sphere than perhaps the Arctic. But at the end of the day, everything fits in together, and so I find you do a pretty good, admirable job of adding a lot of detail, but also covering a lot of ground. So it's really well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, okay, so well, it's a very fluid area, right? And I think all of us are very interested in thinking about at the macro level the dynamics that are driving U.S.-China relationship, whether it's in terms of cooperation or rivalry. Uh, Everyone's writing about that from one perspective or another. But if we narrow the lens a little bit and we look at it from a maritime perspective, what kind of trends do you see emerging? Uh, how would you describe the current kind of nature of strategic objectives or goals that underpin both China and the United States' maritime strategy right now?
Thank you for that's a very good question. It's very challenging because I consider myself as more on the legal approach than a general big picture strategy goal. So I always very in a very bad position. Maybe Professor Shen he can talk broadly on the strategy, but I do try my best to understand in writing this book about how the U.S. strategy, maritime strategy involved and how China's strategy involved throughout this year. So let me be very precisely telling what's my finding. So I didn't look all the way back to earlier century in understanding U.S. maritime strategy. I think I was called by one report published, I think back in 2000 by Rand Corporation. I think the title of the report is the United States and Asia towards a new U.S. strategy force posture. I think that book for the first time raised the importance of U.S. in the concept of ocean control. And developing from there, we see the most recent Ford administration in developing this maritime strategy. For instance, in the Bush administration, he proposed to apply the balance of power as the Bush administration. And then down to the Obama administration, I think we hear a lot using the Asia Pacific rebalance and Hillary Clinton's visit to Southeast Asia and then Asia Pacific pivot. So we have a lot of discussion on how U.S. increasing its interest in the South China Sea. So Obama administration proposed to deploy about 60% of the Navy in the Asia Pacific region. And this is the Obama administration. And then the Trump administration, we hear a lot of discussion of developing Asia Pacific to the concept of Indo-Pacific. That's in 2017, we hear this Asia Pacific doctrine from the US government. So we see that on the one hand, the U.S. continue to enhance its presence in the South China and West Pacific, but it also broaden its scope into the Indo-Pacific. And then coming to the current Biden administration, I think the charter of U.S. strategy in competition with China has pivoted towards the Western Pacific. That's why we see a lot of more and more frequency of U.S. navigation or warship presence in the South China Sea. So to summarize, I think it's worth to know that although the Obama administration talking about increasing the presence of Navy, and then it's until Trump administration who actually brought this concept and have a concrete roadmap of achieving this goal. And then the current Biden administration, I think it's until now we have a clear photo of how U.S. Define its maritime strategy. That's my understanding. And down to the China, I think there are three terms I want to mention. The first one is that during the early stage when China was founded in 90 after 49. So back in that time when we're understanding China's maritime strategy, we talk a lot about sovereignty or territorial integrity and increasing the defense capability in the coastal area. And then at that time, I think China talked a lot about the perceived external threat. So they're talking about, well, we have to make sure that maintain our territorial integrity. And then down to the 1970s, another key area, a period, because 1978 is the timing that China reformed, started like opening policy to outside world. And then combined with economic reform policy, I think there was also sort of thinking change to switch in terms of its maritime strategy. So in addition to maintaining its position on integrity of territory, it also mentioned the importance of ocean governance and developing cooperation to replace the zero-sum strategy. So we see a lot of trends starting from 1978. And then into the 20th century, I think all the people who are working on the ocean, we know this concept of 20th century, the century of the ocean. And that's why the current Chinese leadership focus a lot on talking about developing its maritime strategy to become a strong maritime power. So this is how I understand the development of these two countries' maritime strategy development. Correct me if I misinterpreted the U.S. Strategy later.
And where does the logic lead if you try to look forward 5, 10, 15 years down the road?
It's a very hard question. I think that's the research question I try to answer in my conclusion. Actually, I think there's not an absolute one side of their conclusion. I believe in the near 10 or 15 years, we'll continue to see competition between the US and China in the broader maritime regions, standing all the way from South China Sea all the to the north. But on the other hand, I think I try to, in each chapter, I try very hard to find whether there's some area that the two countries can find common interests address, either through providing, for instance, international public goods to help with some coastal state where they have lack of capacity in terms, for instance, search and rescue, for instance. And then, yeah, hopefully in the near future, on the one hand, it's like what we see the current US-China relations. We're not going to see the competition go away very quickly, but we do hope the cooperation will be something that we can anticipate in the future as well.
Okay, well, maybe in a few minutes, I'd like to talk a bit about the environmental dimensions of cooperation. I think that's an area that we really need to spend some time thinking about, right? But since you mentioned your conclusion, I thought it was interesting because you noted it. I maybe not quoting you verbatim here, so forgive me, but you were noting how, from your perspective, and I think it's understandable. You're noting that the United States is actually taking a fairly assertive approach to projecting power and influence in oceans globally, and even more specifically in the South China Sea. But you also mentioned that your perspective, China has shown considerable restraint when it comes to its approach to the same issue. And I have to confess that when I read that, I had a half of a raised eyebrow, because that might not be the way I would qualify China's posture. But I wonder if you can help kind of unpack your perspective on that for me and for the audience.
Okay, let me see where I can start. Maybe I can pick the South China Sea as one subject that most people are more familiar with understanding. So the reason I'm saying that China is being constrained, because when I compare, let me put it this way, restraint. Yes, yes. I think in order to under China's role in the South China Sea, that's one approach I trying to using the language of law of the sea to understand US and China engagement. Let me put it this way. I think in the South China Sea, China is the coastal state, and it has its obligation provided by law of the sea, and also it has its maritime rights. And the United States certainly has its legitimate interest in the South China Sea by asserting its free navigation, which certainly we have different opinion on interpreting that, but I think the U.S. has it's an important stakeholder in the South China Sea. So when I say being constrained, for instance, let me pick one example. Like back in 2001, 2009, there are a lot of military not really collision, but incident in the sea, in the South China Sea. I think we have a lot of back and forth in US and China argument on that. But in the most recent years, for instance, on the one hand, every time when the US conducted free navigation, closer and closer to China's coastline, and the diplomatic side always send a notice that we are not happy with what the US is doing. It's close and it's infringe, for instance, its maritime rights. But I think China and the US has been very calm to handle these issues using a lot of cues to make sure that no incident happen in sea, even though they have clashes of interest in this region. But I think this is only one example. And the other example, when we look at how China and other South China Sea claimants they deal with each other, probably we hear from the most recent media coverage, China was being pictured as bully or aggressive. But if we put into the context, like all these, like China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and also Malaysia, the all coast states, if we put them into the context of the law of the sea, everyone knows about that is obligation, that's our maritime right. If we're talking about the same picture, I think China doesn't do that as described in many of the media. So it's very hard to try to explain in very such short time. But I think if we're using the same language and putting all the scenario in the same like narrative discourse, probably I will make my argument more
Sure.
understandable.
No,
Yeah.
but I think it's interesting to get that perspective, and you know it's food for thought for sure, and maybe some of our other panelists have some perspectives on that as well. Maybe we can move to the environmental question. I know it's woven, it's a leitmotif inside your book. You know, you mentioned it, and it's woven into many of the chapters. I wonder if you could share any thoughts, for example, when it comes to issues such as overfishing in international waters. Uh, Also, for example, this emerging field where now technologically it's more and more feasible to be extracting minerals from the seabed, and if you take a look at the ISA and you know its vulnerabilities as a governance body, et cetera, do you see some ways where in these critical areas, U.S., China, and also perhaps other middle powers, if you will, including Canada, could kind of like work more effectively together to ensure that at least in areas that are not completely contentious, right?
Yeah.
From fishing, well, fishing is a tricky one, but from fishing to mineral extraction to indeed the Antarctic, for example, there's some mechanisms that could be encouraged or that should be really looked at more closely in order to ensure better global cooperation.
Yeah, I think marine environment it's very important, very important, and they could range all the way from marine environment protection to oil spill that we heard a lot of incidents, not in the South China, but in other areas, maritime regions, and fishing, as you mentioned, mining. I think I can refer to two cases to make the argument that the U.S. and China they can actually have a lot of opportunity to cooperate. Well, first of all, in the South China Sea, that's not between U.S. and China. In the South China Sea, for instance, although we hear a lot over competing interests, but air fishing, and also marine environment protection is one of the areas I think most of these coastal states has put a lot of effort in pursuing this one. We have, for instance, internationalization, UNAP, and large marine ecosystem. There are a lot of international regional mechanism inputs in America, making sure the environment protection in the South China Sea is achieved. And then also the regional states, all these countries, if I'm not mistaken, I think all these little states, they have proposed and they're making sure, for instance, the marine protected area in the coastal state, not necessarily in overlapping areas, but I can see a lot of efforts from the regional coastal state by, first of all, ratifying a lot of international or multilateral legal instruments in line with marine environment protection and in line with fishing. But coming to the US and China, I think I look at, for instance, in the concept of South Pacific and in Arctic and also Antarctica, I try to understand what are the areas they can all cooperate. But given the context of climate change, the Arctic, and also mining, we're talking a lot of mining in Antarctica. Those are the areas that China and the US actually can find a common interest. For instance, you mentioned about the deep mining, and there is always a conflict of group. On the one hand, it's environment, the other is mining in terms of resource extraction. But there's always a way to find a common interest. I think the US and China in the Antarctica, the US talking a lot about conservation, and China is on board, but China slightly have a different opinion because China will endorse the U.S. position on conservation in Antarctica by also talking about for rational use when it's applicable with international law, like fishing. And I believe that China and the U.S. have cooperation in fishing and Alaska. They have an agreement in terms of fighting IUU fishing. I think there's a lot of areas can work together with. I'm happy that I can try very hard to find some common area.
Great. Well, maybe we can stop there for now. I think the purpose of
Yes.
us chatting first before turning to the subject matter experts was to try to help set the stage. But I think now that there's a fair kind of sense of what you cover in your book. Unless you want to give us maybe in closing a couple of quick hits in terms of because you cover such ground, right? You mentioned your 6 chapters. Before I turn to Greg, would you be able to kind of give us a synopsis, like a 1 or 2 sentence kind of synopsis for each of those chapters? Like
Okay.
when it comes to, China, U.S. and the Arctic,
Okay.
what does that mean?
Okay.
China, U.S. and the Antarctic,
Okay.
or is that is that a
Yeah,
fair question?
it's a fair and it's
And the
a
stage will
very
be set, and we can
yeah,
move on to our panelists.
yeah, it's fair and it's challenging. In 1 or 2 sentences, I think I use different approach when I write about these chapters. So for instance, when the US and China, I focus more on international institutions, their role and the engagement with international institutions in the Arctic and in the Antarctica. And then in the chapter of South China Sea and Yellow Sea and the East China Sea, I focus more on, for instance, U.S. as a user state and China as a coastal state. And, and then in the chart of South Pacific and Indian Ocean, I pictured both China and the US as non-neutral states. So and then the focus will be how they engage and how their relation with respective regional states. That's a very important approach. And then in the context of particularly on the North East China Sea and then the Yellow Sea, I wrote very little about the legal because the legal issue is not complicated at all in the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, but it's more on political dimension, given that the US, for instance, increasing its relationship with Japan, and we hear this little group of the US and Japan at the Philippines. So we see a lot of political. So it's very hard to answer your question, but it's a lot of dimension, and I try not to be ambitious to explain Hobo in such a short notice. But I was looking forward to our speakers.
Okay. Well, that's wonderful. So I think there's more than enough food for thought here. So perhaps I can turn now to one of our 3 panelists. We'll start with Greg. You're here in the room. So Greg Poling is the director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, where he's also a senior fellow. He's a leading expert on the South China Sea disputes and conducts research on U.S. alliances and partnerships, democratization and governance in Southeast Asia, as well as maritime security across the Indo-Pacific. Gregory is also the author of the recently published On Dangerous Ground, America's Century in the South China Sea, along with various works on U.S. relations with Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and Southeast Asia writ large. Gregory's writings have been featured in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, Naval War College Review, among other publications. And Gregory also has an MA in International Affairs from American University and a BA in History and Philosophy from St. Mary's College in Maryland. So, Greg, do you have any thoughts?
Well, thank you very much for a too kind introduction, and thanks for Nong for inviting me. So I'm not going to address China's maritime strategy. I will reflect on U.S. maritime strategy and where we intersect. I don't disagree with the way Nong framed it, but I would push the story back a little bit farther. I mean, I think you can split the U.S. maritime strategy writ large into 2 components that overlap. One is the strategic picture, which is what Nong mostly talked about, and the one we hear about the most. And then there's more legal or normative component, and I actually think that's the older one. There's very few foreign policy issues you can find coming up in U.S. security strategies, U.S. presidential statements, U.S. congressional resolutions that are older and more consistent than a focus on freedom of navigation or freedom of the seas, however you want to frame this. And this it's deeply ingrained, I think, in U.S. strategic culture. It dates back to the early history of the Republic as a maritime trading nation, and one that was pretty vulnerable and largely reliant on the protection of larger powers, particularly the British. one of the very first acts of the U.S. Congress after the ratification of the Constitution was to set aside money for the first ships of the U.S. Navy. Most of the early United States, early military expeditions were related in one way or another to the defense of U.S. maritime rights, whether that was the two wars against Barbary states or the war we fought against Canada that we sometimes call the War of 1812, blame on the British. And then eventually the U.S. arrival in the Indo-Pacific as a maritime power with the establishment of the Asiatic Fleet. And you can draw that line all the way through to the negotiations on the first three UN conferences on the Law of the Sea. And in the South China Sea in particular, the U.S., I think, very consistent focus on freedom of navigation in every government statement since at least 1995. And that's where we get into these normative and legal disagreements. There are disagreements, some of them unbridgeable and some of them manageable, between the way the U.S. views freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation and the way China does. But at the core of it, I would argue that there is also an almost philosophical difference. Difference is that the U.S. has a deep-seated belief in the universality of international law, particularly as applied to the law of the sea. And I know that that sounds somewhat odd, given that the U.S. is a signatory but not a party to the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. But remember, the U.S. position has always been that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is an encapsulation of customary maritime law, and that it applies to everybody, whether you've ratified the treaty or not. China's approach, I think, is more utilitarian, more particularist in a sense, that the law is to be applied more flexibly, that it is not necessarily universal in its application, and that it has to adjust as the realities of power in the international system adjust. And so a China that was willing to accept certain conditions in order to ratify UNCLOS in the 90s or to conclude it in 1982 is no longer willing to accept all the conditions. And that brings the US and China into, at times, unbridgeable disagreements in South and East China Seas. But there are other areas where we continue to have shared interests. Nong highlighted our cooperation in the North Pacific. We continue to cooperate, US and Chinese Coast Guards, in enforcing the UN Convention that bans drift net fishing. We cooperated in negotiating the recently concluded UN Convention on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. We have tried and so far failed to cooperate on the WTO regime banning subsidies in the fishing industry. But the farther you get from China's shores and the farther you get from the core disputes around freedom of navigation, I do think the more overlap you find in US and Chinese interests in governance of the oceans and maritime law. Now, how do we deal with the unbridgeable parts? Well, here's where management is key. And Nong's absolutely right. Despite our disagreements, despite some pretty tense moments, whether we talk about the third Taiwan Strait crisis, the EP3 incident, the impeccable incident in 2009, we have historically managed to responsibly de-escalate tensions that crop up largely driven by US and Chinese differences over interpretations of key components of international law, particularly the laws applied to innocent passage through the territorial sea and the right of foreign military activity within the exclusive economic zone. I grew anxious. I think a lot of people on both sides of the Pacific grew anxious over the last few years that ability to manage and de-escalate tensions was breaking down. And the most visible aspect of that, I think, was the rise in the frequency of unsafe air-to-air interactions over both the South and East China Sea, involving not just the US, but also Canada, Australia, and Japan with PLA aircraft from late 2021 on. Now I sit here a little more optimistic than I was even 6 months ago, because when President Xi and President Biden met on the sidelines of the APEC summit last fall outside of San Francisco, they agreed to restart military-to-military dialogues. We just had first defense minister level consultation in several years. We also just had the first maritime consultation earlier this month in several years. But more importantly, that agreement led to a very real decrease in the frequency of unsafe air intercept. As far as we know from sources in both, public statements from both Washington and Ottawa, we have seen a notable decrease in the frequency of unsafe air intercepts by the PLA Air Force toward US aircraft mainly over South China Sea and Canadian aircraft mainly over the East China Sea. If that continues, then our somewhat unbridgeable disagreements, at least for the moment, about the right of military activity in the EEZ remain manageable. Points of tension, but not necessarily points of escalation. And I think that's the key to great powers responsibly managing their differences. We can't be Pollyannish. We can't imagine that there's some clever solution out there that we just haven't thought of to bridge these U.S. and Chinese differences over interpretation of maritime law. But we can be responsible in how we approach those. I will say, I do think there are solutions to some of these. If we take the issue of innocent passage through the territorial sea, I'm of the opinion, I can't walk it back now because I wrote it down in my book, that the U.S. was in the minority walking into the third UN conference on demanding complete ability to conduct innocent passage without prior notification. If we go all the way back to the first UN conference on the law of the sea in 1958, it's clear that the majority of states in the international system supported at least prior notification. It was actually the Soviet demand for prior permission that sunk that. If the Soviets had been willing to compromise and accept prior notification, that would be the regime of customary law today. So I do think it's possible to imagine that we come up with a regime in which the U.S. and others, there will have to be negotiations that don't seem possible now, would offer prior notification for passage through the territorial sea. The issue of military activity in the EEZ is more unbridgeable because there was a clear decision reached in UNCLOS 3. Now, China, India, Thailand, many others never accepted that, and I think we would have to look for some kind of political arrangement, but that's how diplomacy works. We always find face-saving political arrangements. The letter of the law may allow something, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to happen. That said, we are not in a position right now where the U.S. or China are able to negotiate such an agreement, so we need to manage these tensions. I'll conclude there. Thank you.
That's very insightful. Thank you, and welcome your kind of optimism, or optimism would be a bit of a strong word.
I'm so rarely accused of optimism.
Right? That now that there's resumed military dialogues at high level, that the relationship is a little bit less fraught, and that the room for misunderstanding and conflict is lessened as well. So, and I very much took note of your observation that the further we move away from the South China Sea sphere, the greater the opportunities perhaps for working together between U.S. and China. So I think that's all something to keep in mind. I wonder, before I turn to the next panelist, when we look at those areas perhaps where there could be cooperation that's accretive to the global commons, if you will, do you see any specific examples that you want to throw out there?
So I think there's room to cooperate, particularly on counter-IUU fishing, because increasingly Beijing recognizes that the illicit activity of China's distant water fleet has become a net negative for China's geopolitical ambitions, and we've seen a real effort by Beijing to dial that back. I actually think there's opportunity also to see China play a bigger role in defending the global commons in other areas. I mean, I would point obviously to the Red Sea as an example here, where you see this difference in the U.S. and China's approach. The U.S. and the British, and overall the European approach has been the universalist approach to defend freedom of navigation in the Red Sea as a universal right, including, by the way, U.S. Navy ships defending Chinese flagged vessels that have been targeted by Houthi rebels. People don't appreciate the fact that the U.S. has used its own missiles and money to knock down missiles targeting Chinese vessels. China's approach has been more particularist. China has chosen to negotiate its own separate arrangement with the Houthis rather than pursue defense of the global commons. Mm-hmm. I think as China emerges as a global maritime power, which it is, we should look to it to take on more of the responsibility to defend the regime.
Okay, well, that's very noteworthy as well, something to think about. Perhaps we can turn now to Professor Shen. Dingni Shen is Professor Emeritus and former Executive Dean at Fudan University's Institute of International Studies, and is also former Director of the Center for American Studies. He is also an honorary visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and has taught international security, China-U.S. relations, China's foreign and defense policy in China, the U.S., and the Semester at Sea program. His research and publications cover China-U.S. security relations, regional security and research and publications, international strategy, arms control, non-proliferation, foreign and defense policy of China and the U.S., and other related subjects. So you can see that it's very much on point when it comes to discussing the topic today. Professor Shen is also vice president of the Shanghai UN Research Association and the Shanghai Public Policy Research Association, and he was vice president of the Chinese Association of South Asian Studies, Shanghai Association of International Studies, the Shanghai Association of International Strategic Studies, and the Shanghai Association of American Studies. He had his PhD in physics from Fudan, the postdoc in arms control at Princeton, was Eisenhower Fellow in '96, and advised in then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2002 regarding strategic planning for the Secretary General's second term. He's on the Global Council of the Asia Society and has been appointed by both the Shanghai and Hangzhou municipalities as a convention ambassador. He has co-edited 17 books, so you've got some work to do, no? And published over 2,500 papers and articles worldwide. So I think without any further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and my warm congratulations to Hong Nong for publishing your new book. I hope someday soon I will be able to read it. After your introduction of the contents of this latest book, I got some feel of what you try to play a role in bridging Chinese and non-Chinese perspective on those crucial issues regarding maritime order. I remember your co-panelist from CSIS used to invite me to speak on the very day of the international ruling with Philippines' request of arbitration. So in 2016, I was on the podium at the CSIS meeting. You well designed that day for us to elaborate. So first issue we discuss is how we look at the permanent core of arbitration ruling, in which China lose all, 0 versus 15, vis-a-vis Philippines' request for arbitration. So because the theme of this deliberation is about cooperation and some seemingly possible, unavoidable competition. Let me give my 2 cents. Theoretically, nations should cooperate, and they used to successfully cooperate on many non-traditional maritime security issues. For instance, on anti-pirate, Indian Navy used to lend its hand to save Chinese commercial ocean liner in the area close to India. So even though India and China have some traditional security dispute, especially concerning the border issue, but India lent its hand. That's great, but that is of the nature of non-traditional security. And also US also lent its hand to save Chinese merchandise ship in the past in the area of the Gulf of Eden. And 10 years ago, international members sent their respective national fleet to the area of Gulf of Eden to create international coalition to protect all nations' shipping freedom in that area. Regrettably, China provided its service with one country's capacity. But all the other countries, they created international fleet led by the US warship. So one warship does not need to travel entire region, and it's impossible to protect the entire region. But through international cooperation, Our national navy should be responsible for a tiny length in that area, but 10 countries, 30 countries can protect the entire region. I only hope such a kind of spirit of international cooperation would return. And China someday would land its navy under the command of the American warship. Or American warship would allow Chinese warship to lead the American warship. That would generate the true spirit of international cooperation. Now I feel very bad. Chinese warship refused to protect American commercial ship in the Red Sea. Maybe U.S. ship has not asked for help, but maybe China has not noticed U.S. ship, commercial ship needs help, and there is no such cooperation. I feel bad. In my view, there are some problem between Yemen's Houthi military group with Israel. They should not attack other country, no matter it's ocean liner or warship, just because Houthi has a difficulty with Israel. They should not attack China, Russia, US, UK, and occasionally they mistargeted China. But they stated in the future they would not attack China. I only feel embarrassed. Why you don't attack China? You attack America. You make China and US to have more misunderstanding. Whether China wished both sides to attack America and UK. So more trouble America would have, the more happier China would become. I hope this is not the case. I would only feel more unhappy if China is not attacked while America is attacked. All countries should be attacked, and all countries should not be attacked. And one country attacked, all the other countries, especially the P5, the unattacked P5 country, should launch its retaliation to safeguard the UN Charter. The UN system has made it clear for security issue. Any country, even not a signatory of the United Nations, should observe any UN Security Council resolution. So at this time, China and Russia would block any effort to condemn both sides. They would only abstain for a resolution that would not name both sides. They would probably condemn any unwarranted military action. But for such a behavior, to attack civilian ship is simply intolerable. It's against the UN Charter. And no security member should vote against it. And all standing members should not veto it to virtually protect the attacker. I feel very bad. We are way distant from those times when China, US, and many NATO countries send their navy to cooperate in one way or another in the area of Gulf of Eden. Let me talk about some international concern regarding China's maritime behavior. There are two types of concern they may have. One is regarding some maritime interest, like a seabed-based energy or sea-based nutrition, fishery, vitamin, etc. And the International Permanent Court has made it clear China's claim of the non-dash line, within which China has the permanent fishery rights or economic rights, is unwarranted. China has different view. I'm not a judge to say China is right. Even I'm Chinese national, I'm not in Chinese government position that anything China does is right. And certainly, I have no guts to say some of the things China is doing is wrong. I'm not courageous enough. But at least I would not defend China. Because UNCLOS is a part of UN law. It's not a national law. It is not a unilateral law. It is not a multilateral law. It is a global law in which China is a full member. US has not ratified it. China has ratified. Of course, China has certain reservation regarding certain paragraph, certain section. China has reservation. But for such a very serious matter, when China claims it has a permanent fishing rights with the entire 9-dash line from the south end to the north end, it spans over 1,200 nautical miles, which is 6 times as long as 200 nautical miles, which is the legal rights for any maritime country to claim with certain limit. Normally, that's 200 nautical miles. Occasionally, you can get permitted to get 350 nautical miles. And also, occasionally, when the two countries may not share as big as more than 400 nautical miles, they may negotiate to find a certain middle way. When China claims to have 6 times as long as the legally permitted fishing rights, that generates the displeasure of many ASEAN countries, Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, and Vietnam, etc. So that's very unusual because normally China's peace development and a smile diplomacy has won the hearts of many countries. But this time, I think many members of ASEAN countries have real concern. This is a bigger challenge because we never claimed Taiwan when it drew the line in 1946-47. And even the current Taiwan regime did not claim it intended to have this interpretation. This interpretation is only expressed by the PRC, mainland China, within the last 20 years, even not before 20 years. So it's new. How such a new demand, which has been vastly differed by many other countries, especially maritime countries, like Australia, US, Japan, Indonesia, and Canada. They all cannot agree. So I think I would not say China is wrong, but I would also not say China is right. I think China has had a big challenge with many of its members of the international community to a vast disagreement. This may have casted a watershed for an age of internationally claimed China's peaceful rise. To the post stage, China may no longer rise peacefully. China may use its muscle to claim rights, which may not belong to it. I'm not saying it's my view. I'm saying I understand this is the view of many Chinese neighbors and members of the international community. That may give Hong Nong some idea to name her new book, Inevitable Competition. No, I think it's inevitable. It can be avoided. If China were to claim we only have 200 nautical miles, but before 1982, we used to fish everywhere. But after 1982, we may still fish globally, but we'll be careful not to fish in any other maritime country's EEZ. If we want, we would negotiate with them to create various bilateral agreement for how much and when, what kind of vessel China can enter, and what kind of economic compensation China should give back to those countries who may legally allow China's fishing boats to fish in a negotiated term. This way, other countries would accept China. And this way, China may invite less trouble, as our fishermen were shot by Russia's navy. We entered Russia's EEZ for a reason, to navigate, but only for navigate. They would not shoot. They figured out China's fishing boat were steering their fish. They shoot. Chinese media did not report. I feel very hurt. We claim as a Russian strategic friend, why they shoot our fishermen? Even they steal some fish. Our fishermen do not deserve their life to be deprived of by Russia's military. But if we don't enter their water, or we enter into their water and wait for them to inspect, to be fined, to be jailed, but rather than to free. So we should be very careful in expressing we do have the right not to observe EEZ, not to respect all other maritime countries' EEZ rights, that all foreign vessels are qualified to navigate inside the EEZ, but are not qualified in conducting economic activity, whether fishing or mining to take seabed-based resource. And this, in my view, can be avoided if China can clean its internal water, to replace the seafood with water food, with lake food, river food, pond food. We may not need that many seafood. Or if we need seafood, learn from Japan to take seafood away from other countries' EEZ. But even Japan has invited lots of international angry because they took too much sea-based food, which is close to Australia. So China should also avoid Japan's mistake. Of course, there is some recipe. Someday with global warming, the Arctic Sea may be totally melt. New York and Shanghai will be flooded. Then we can go to the north side to the fishery. Then we will be shot by Canada, by America, and by Russia within their 200 nautical miles. These are not the resolution. So the resolution is either quit UNCLOS, which is what I urge the Chinese government to do. Quitting UNCLOS, then we are free of international obligation. You cannot be both a member of EEZ without respecting EEZ. But also I hate to learn from America, quitting ABM, quitting Open Sky Treaty, and quitting those START or other strategic arms treaty. Once we joined, our hand will be bound. That's good for other countries to trust China, to predict China's international behavior. But when all other members of the international system also joined the same treaty, they are willing to bind their hands with the same framework. That gives China predictability of this country's international behavior. We lose some, we gain some. Overall, we gain more by losing. I regret America has not ratified UNCLOS, which make America does not look that great. So recently, some American statesmen are urging Americans should seriously look at the possibility to ratify UNCLOS. That would give America more legality and morality to urge China to fully implement China's international legal obligation. So US can do better. China can do better. But the US sometimes did not do better. US attacked Iraq without international mandate. And Russia attacked Ukraine without international mandate. China has been doing better. China has not attacked a substantial country without international mandate. Since 1988, China has not militarily waged a war with any neighbors. That's marvelous. Russia has waged a few times, Georgia and Ukraine for 2 times, America a lot of times, and China 0 time. So this is a word. America may exercise more patience, persuading other UN Security Council members not to veto Americans' interests to send a UN force into Iraq, not an American force. America should avoid international dispute, should avoid a pitfall. Many American men and women could die, and money can be spent in such a unnecessary way. And Russia is still waging a war that could make that country in great trouble, preventing its legitimate peaceful rise. So these are what I see. We all commit a mistake in various degree, in traditional security area and in non-traditional security area. Each are finding its excuse why my wrongdoing may be not wrongdoing. I feel regretful. We are great power, permanent member of Security Council. We should be very restrictive, should exercise more legal and moral restriction upon our external behavior. Rather, exercise our international action with a loose standard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing those insights. And indeed, as you say, if China is now a rising global power, then with that rise also comes responsibilities. And I think your exhortation to encourage China to exhibit moral leadership and also live up to commitments is something that I think we all support, because, as you say, there's a need for leadership by example these days in the international sphere. I also think it's very helpful for everyone here to look at the dynamic in the South China Sea from the food security lens, which is one that you presented to us. It offers a very useful lens to perhaps garner some insights with respect to the nuances of Chinese foreign policy. And finally, I think it's very helpful for all of us to hear your insights in terms of how we can slowly try to tilt the balance away from competition and towards cooperation at the macro level. So I'm sure this will stimulate a few questions that maybe we can get to during the Q&A. So thank you, Professor. And maybe now we can turn to our third panelist, Gilang Canberra, if I have the right pronunciation, who's a research fellow with the Maritime Security Program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Gilang holds an MA in International Relations and a Bachelor in Science in Business Management from the University of Birmingham. He has 7 years of experience working as a researcher with CSIS in Indonesia, where his research covers maritime policies, Indonesia's foreign policies, Indo-Pacific strategies, as well as strategic and security issues. Gilang's research interests include maritime security and maritime safety, Indonesia and ASEAN maritime policy, as well as strategic studies. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip, and good evening from Singapore, and also good morning to you all in the United States. Thank you for having me for this book talk and this discussion. And first of all, may I extend a heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Hong Nong for her third book, and I can't wait to have her book grace our library here at RSIS. So be sure to send a packet of this to Singapore. Okay, so I have some points that I'd like to put across based on the discussion that we've had regarding Dr. Hong Nong's third book and also some of the discussion with the previous panelists. Now, I'd also like to extend some appreciation to provide a voice from Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not going to put on any Southeast Asian states or nation cap in particular. I'm here to represent perhaps pretty much all of Southeast Asia's perspective. But to kickstart on my first point, based on our discussion, is that we here in Southeast Asia certainly would welcome a greater pursuit of cooperation and compared to competition. Certainly, what we've seen for the past couple of years and decades here in Southeast Asia, especially due to intense and ever more intense U.S.-China competition and rivalry, that there have been very somewhat normalized hedging strategy that's been taken by pretty much almost all Southeast Asian member states for the past years. And this is very much apparent on states such as Indonesia, Malaysia, to some extent Singapore as well. But there's a recent trend that we see that a number of Southeast Asian states looking at this, competition has started to, bandwagon more to a certain side of the camp. This, for example, we've heard about how Cambodia has shifted, or at least have gained more of a closer relations with China. We've seen how the military junta in Myanmar has taken more of a camp, perhaps with Russia and also China to some extent. And we've seen very recently in how Philippines has doubled down on its commitment with its U.S. allies, with its U.S. as an ally. And this, doesn't bode well for us here in Southeast Asia, whereas we remembered Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore written in 2020 that Asian countries do not want to be forced to choose if come that choice between the two great powers or maybe more. Because when it's time for Asian countries to choose, or when we are forced to choose, then the prosperity that has been identified with Asia for the past decades will effectively and automatically cease to exist or erode due to competition, perhaps open conflict that would entail to it. So we certainly strive to ensure that we don't see that conflict ever happening soon. And so far we can somewhat pat ourselves in the back to say that conflict has not exploded in Asia Pacific for considerable amount of time. And we certainly hope that further cooperation can be, certainly be enacted. And this comes to my somewhat second point, in a way that, as Dr. Hong Nong has mentioned, how we're putting some actions on cooperation, especially in the maritime front. And I do like to second on that, especially cooperation that achieves or strive to the benefit of the greater good. So not cooperation that is only beneficial to one side, not a cooperation, or at least a certain support, just to be reactive, just to check upon the other party. So, for example, we've seen how policies catered from both China or the United States that it will support Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries if it's just a means to an end to check the other rival. So I can, tit for tat or provision of certain security guarantee or perhaps defense cooperation just to provide a boost to check China or perhaps to check the United States in that sense. And also I'd like to implore that in the sense of cooperation or in the pursuit of the greater good, it is imperative that both parties strive to avoid playing a double standard in upholding the international system. And I think this is more than apparent in these day and age, and especially when I heard that the United States questioned or at least put a comment that the UNSC resolution is non-binding, it certainly doesn't put a lot of faith that that its support behind the international system, will be kept to the future. So it's certainly we'd like to avoid seeing a double standard when it comes to provision of support across for the entire greater good. And I do support what I've heard from Dr. Hong Nong regarding revisiting some of the low-hanging fruits of maritime cooperation. And this is something that we actively strive to discuss with some of our colleagues as well. Search and rescue has also been a very important component, especially when it comes to when we see an increasing amount of natural disasters and man-made disasters here in Southeast Asia. Humanitarian disaster relief is an ever more and ever pressing need for most of the people in this area, and certainly that the capacity that we have is somewhat still inadequate to answer a very large disaster that might loom into the future. Other areas such as sustainable economic policies needs to be put in place, certainly to ensure that the fruit of the benefit of what we reap is not going to be wasted just in the next 20 or 50 years, but perhaps to sustain it for a longer period of time. And perhaps certainly this bodes really well for environment, in human security, and also health, public health, perhaps, as we learn from COVID-19 pandemic. And coming to my third point, and then hopefully this will be my last point as well, is that we do strive and hope that when it comes to cooperation, and when we try to when we try to realize these maritime cooperation, we want cool heads certainly to prevail. That rational minds think ahead of reactive mindset of certainly mindset that promotes coercive policy instead. Now here, certainly we do understand that certain coercive policies created by both sides, whether it's the United States or China, sometimes it has reason. Greg mentioned about freedom of navigations, especially in South China Sea. Now we certainly don't necessarily have complete objection towards freedom of navigation. It is within certain remits of international law that states can exercise innocent passage in international waters, but it certainly causes friction, certainly, that is being brought, that the barrier is being brought more on the littoral states, for example, in South China Sea. So certainly we try to keep things under constant balance, that we don't let it tip towards one end or tip the scale. And for example, coming back to Asia Pacific, for the issues surrounding Taiwan, certainly, because we've had more and more discussion and more concern emanating from that end of the area, where we know that hundreds and thousands of Southeast Asian souls do rely on their day-to-day activities and lives over in Taiwan. And we certainly, the last thing, of course, that we thought about is that it doesn't really matter whether the United States can exercise its transit passage over Taiwan Strait one time, 50 times, or 100 times, or that China continually challenge Taiwan's ADIZ. We only ask, to what end? What benefits does it seek, aside from your own personal gain, certainly? So hopefully when cool heads starts to prevail and look into the more greater cooperation that can be achieved, in a multilateral scale, I suppose coercive policies would be and hopefully be scaled back, because it only breeds increase and further resentment from both parties. And it, in terms to achieve stability, it certainly takes two to tango, and perhaps even more when there's more parties involved on the dance floor. And perhaps my third and a half point, also hopefully my last one, is that from this, both parties, I suppose, strive to establish a sort of like inclusive platforms, inclusive in a way that, as how the United States include China in its post-World War II international system, 21st century, system should also find ways for both parties, United States and China, to continue discussions, to continue talk. What we've seen so far in the 2000s is that some of the introduction or some of the multilateral groupings and agreements that has been introduced, for example, from the United States, has not particularly grown or has not particularly been fond of inclusiveness. Quad, for example, and also AUKUS serves to some extent, certainly, to ensure United States interest is kept in check in the region. despite it never saying that it is there to curtail China, but we're not. We certainly can feel how it just provides more irks and resentment from Beijing. As such, and such of these fit for purpose only multilateral engagements would only allow the geopolitical tension to break the international system rather than invigorate, which we certainly seek to. And so here in Southeast Asia, we always believe that inclusiveness is the key forward, as inclusiveness would allow us to, to think that conflict is effectively not inevitable, it is evitable, that conflict can be put aside, and that we understand that accommodating one another is a possibility, is not impossible, and that communication between one another is not an exchange of threats, but rather an exchange of ideas and discussion between parties. And certainly that quote was actually stated by JFK back in the 60s. So I think this would resonate quite a lot with some of the folks back at the stateside. With that, I'll stop there and hand back the floor to the moderator. Thanks.
Thanks, Gilang. And I don't know how many. Do we have a lot of questions from the audience? Or so we have about. I'm gonna decide to extend this by another 5 minutes. We have about 10 minutes. We're gonna take 10 minutes. Let's do a few quick hits, and while people prepare their questions, I'm gonna start with a quick follow-up question to get things going, and it kind of basically draws on Gilang some of your remarks. So I'm kind of interested about the notion of ASEAN centrality and how, as you were mentioning right now, there's several countries in the region are the object of attention on the part of either or indeed and. It depends. So the U.S. and China are basically pulling at countries such as the Philippines and Cambodia, but also some other countries are also actually the object of attention from both the U.S. and China, right? So this push and pull, is this a real threat to the ASEAN centrality approach? Does this lead to a fracturing? Or any insights about that from anyone on the panel or from you, Noel?
I'm happy to add, but I think I'll defer to Nong and Gilang.
Okay, I can start by sharing my observation. I think, well, Gilang, I agree with his observation that within ASEAN, and when consider, because I realize that currently when we talk about the South China Sea, everything is about the US-China relations, compared with a narrative back in maybe a decade ago, where China is talking to individual across the day or talking to ASEAN as when we're talking about the COC, Central Maritime Cooperation. But currently, the narrative has been shifted to US-China relations. That's not correct. And I think we understand that every country you have your rights and your obligation, but I think the focus should be the little states and nationality. And then I also agree with some of the observation put by all panelists is how the U.S. and China manages the relationship in the area that they don't have claims. And then we need to, I'm not saying we, I mean, I think the two countries, when they're dealing with many of the issues, for instance, in the South Pacific Ocean. And then we have to also bear in mind they have their own interests and they don't want to be caught up in the middle of the US-China great power competition. Like, for instance, like yesterday at the Solomon Island, it's a vote day. So today they're going to count who's going to win, whether the current president is going to win and he's supporting maybe have more lineage with the China, given its like security pass signed in 2020, or going to have a new president with lean more the US. But I had the same feeling that many of the, for instance, Indian Ocean states, Sri Lanka, for instance, Pakistan, they all have a very difficult position trying to balance with the China in the state. I think that's not right. Yeah, that's my observation.
Sure. ASEAN itself, right, it's always kind of trying to put forward that policy that together they would be better able to defend a common interest than in an uneven kind of like bilateral engagement perspective. Greg, do you have any thoughts about that?
So the proliferation of other multilateral institutions in the region is understandably worrying to ASEAN. I don't think it's necessarily a threat to ASEAN centrality. The question is, how does ASEAN manage this? There have always been multilateral organizations that exist in parallel with ASEAN. And it's not just the Quad and AUKUS. We have the Lancang Mekong Cooperation Initiative. We have, we've always had intra-ASEAN minilateral arrangements. As long as those are working on things that ASEAN doesn't or is unable to work on. The question is, can we manage to not have these things compete directly with ASEAN efforts? So far, they're not. I can't think of a single Quad work stream, single AUKUS work stream, LMI or Lancang Mekong that are overlapping with efforts ASEAN's making. What they are, for the most part, at least if you look at the minilaterals that we saw last week with Prime Minister Kishida and President Marcos here, they are responding to pull factors from the region, right? It's not as if China and the US are forcing unwilling partners to do this, whether it's Philippines, Cambodia, what have you. It is because individual members of ASEAN find ASEAN either absent or unable to engage on issues that are of critical national. And that's obvious in the South China Sea, where I find it telling that when the last several years, when I'm in Jakarta, when I'm in Singapore, even when I'm in Kuala Lumpur, most of the talk around the South China Sea is about US-China conflict, US-China tensions. When I'm in Hanoi and Manila, that is not the narrative. And it's extraordinarily frustrating to Manila and Hanoi that their fellow ASEAN members view the South China Sea as a US-China problem, not a Philippine-China or Vietnam-China problem.
Any other quick comments on that? Or we pass to another question?
Very, very quickly, I suppose I'd just like to add that the ASEAN has been sitting in a very precarious position since the end of the Cold War, in a way that ASEAN always seeks relevancy with current times. And when it comes to, the current contemporary issues, especially with the Indo-Pacific, it always strives and strategically tries to position itself in the more relevant position, as we can see from an ASEAN outlook in the Pacific. But despite that, I wouldn't go as so far to say that the pull factor would lead to ASEAN trying to be very to disintegrate to some extent. In a way, in 50 plus years of its existence, it does allow some identity or a degree of identity for Southeast Asia to say that we do have differences between ourselves. Perhaps we see things differently, but at the end of the day, the issues that we have here is pretty much the issue of Southeast Asian issue, and that the interest and perspective that we hail, comes from our unique identity being that is a Southeast Asian. So I'll stop there.
All right, maybe move on to another related topic, which is a quick question about India. So India is starting to have its moment in the sun economically. If we kind of take a medium-term perspective on things, I think it's reasonable to expect that it will start to have a little bit more capacity to project maritime influence as well. So if we kind of gaze into the future a little bit, do we see India as like a new player that will have an impact one way or another? This is something we need to start reflecting on.
Happy to start. I mean, I think India sees itself rightly as the resident power in the Indian Ocean, and is a lot of India's maritime anxieties toward China are about a sense that is slipping away. And that also helps drive a great deal of the cooperation we've seen over the last few years on the maritime front between the US and India, India and France, India and the UK, India and Singapore. India has really proliferated its maritime cooperation agreements, access agreements, logistics agreements, to ensure that it remains the resident power in the Indian Ocean. But India punches way below its weight outside of the Indian Ocean, and I don't see that changing much. Economically and strategically, India, if you look at every survey, ICAS in Singapore, ARS in Malaysia, the FPCI surveys out of Indonesia, India ranks somewhere below the UK and France and on par with Canada when it comes to the amount of thinking the South Asians do about it. It's largely a non-factor.
I think I agree with Greg's observation. And also, I think India, in its own region in the ocean, for instance, it has a very high security bet with United States, on the other hand, is pursuing economic issues with China. It does have the border dispute between China and India, so it's in a very awkward position. But my observation is that India is trying to increase its influence in other areas beyond its Indian Ocean. For instance, when talking about the South Pacific Oceans, why the regional states, many of the small island states, they are talking about the struggle between U.S. and China. The India is increasing its engagement with many of the island states. On the one hand, it's increasing support. It doesn't want to, and it's not shy from being cool about like playing bigger or intends to have more influence. For instance, it's a very interesting conversation once I participated in the Arctic dialogue. And then not only the littoral states of Ireland, Norway, Canada, the speaker out there, and also speakers from China, India. And then all the conversation is talking about why China is interested in the Arctic, and a lot of discussion is centered on China on the one hand, is not a little state, why it has interest, what is the relationship between China and the United States or Canada. And then we have one Indian scholar say, oh, we do have a lot of interest in Arctic, why not paying attention to India? And also back to the current state of Arctic, because I think the Arctic cooperation cannot be interrupted because of Ukraine war, Ukraine conflict, and then there is ongoing destruction in the Arctic Council work. And then who was looking at China, why China have a lot of cooperation with Russia in the Arctic in supporting or continue to invest its ANG Arctic project, but we tend to forget India is never shy to be a part of the dialogue. It doesn't be shy from, oh, well, India have a strong cooperation with Russia as well. So yeah, India has a very interesting role to play.
We're pretty short on time, but you kind of anticipated perhaps a last question that we could put out there, and that's about unless there's someone in the room who wants to ask one, and that's about the Arctic. So, as you mentioned, Russia's a player there. The U.S. obviously is a player. China is very interested in the region. Canada itself just articulated a new defense policy that really is announcing a doubling down of resources and attention on asserting sovereignty in the Arctic and also deploying more kind of material and resources there. So there's a lot of attention. I think you're quite optimistic, actually, that this may be a terrain where we can come to some productive arrangements. So do you see cooperation between China and the U.S. and the other Arctic states as something that's beyond naive optimism, but it's actually practical?
I agree with that. I think my answer is positive because I see a lot of ongoing or previous cooperation between China and with maybe less with United States in terms of Arctic research. But we do have a lot of cooperation project with other European Nordic states, with Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark as well. So I see a lot of optimism for the US and China to cooperate in terms of enhancing the current Arctic scientific cooperation. Because of the Ukraine conflict, many of the international institutions has paused the funding to support many ongoing like climate-related research project with Russia. So we're just getting out of the current project. I think we need to kick off the international cooperation again. I think this is the area that China and United States should work together. And I have to make sure that China is not the Arctic state, that he pursue its interest in field of like international institution like the Council. Professor, I want to have a different voice with you. I don't encourage China to withdraw from the Lobster Convention. I think it's very important for all the country in order to pursue your maritime interests, whether you're a coastal state or US state. It's very important to abide by international regime, not only by the treaty law, but also by customary law, or participate in many multilateral international institutions. Although sometimes legally debatable, but I think it's very important to have your seat in this regime. So yeah, that's my final word on that.
Okay, well, we're pretty much out of time, but certainly if many of these challenges and topics could be approached the spirit that Professor Shen has tried to share with us, I think that that could leave the world in a better place. So So I think this has been a very productive conversation, especially for our panelists and viewers from Asia. Thank you for joining us rather late in the evening. Thank you for everyone here for joining us in person. And again, Nong, congratulations on the book, and look forward to hearing more conversations about it in the future.
Well, thank you,
Thank
Philippe, for more discussion. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.